Well, hello, masibhotisa mawethu sinamkele kulonyaka mtsha mhle kangaka sinqwenela impumelelo namathamsanqa kulonyaka ka2016. My name is Siphiwo Nzawumbi. Sinamkela kwakhona ke kwinkqubo yethu xa sijongana nemiba yakho wena njengomthengi izonke izinto, all the rights and responsibilities and all the things that we're looking at phaya ku2016. Ukhumbula ke nawe ukuba sikuvalele ngaphandle ke kumba wethu namhlanje. You can call us right in studio. It's 011 714 6918 and of course 6919. You can also send us an email to consumer@sabc.co.za, or rather just go and catch us on social media. On Facebook you'll find our page, that is Yilungelo Lakho, as you see it on the screen, and of course on Twitter you'll be able to find me. My Twitter handle is @Siphiwo Nzawumbi. Well, Happy New Year and good afternoon to you.
The legislation is very clear, is that no tenant can be evicted without a court order.
I shouldn't have done it, but I didn't have a choice. He wasn't here.
They don't care ukuthi ama-tenants bahlala kanjani, i-condition yakhona injani.
Now, whether you're a tenant or a landlord, leasing property is fraught with problems of one kind or another. It is not uncommon to find parties to lease an agreement starting out on a sound and professional footing, but before you know it, you end up at each other's throats. You take the case of a renting default tenant. Chances are they could find their belongings thrown outside or even the premises locked. Now, housing experts say resolving rental disputes without a court process is rather dangerous and unlawful. But before we get to our discussion, let's quickly have a look at this.
Khawube nomfanekiso ngqondweni umka endlini ushiya konke okwakho ngaphakathi komzimba ungenaxhala. Kodwa uthi xa ubuya ubethwe umbono wempahla ehleli lusize emgaqweni ibethwa lilanga nawe ungakwazi ukungena. Ingcali kwimiba yokuqeshiswa kwendawo yokuhlala zithi ayibothusi lento bona kuba ngeli xesha enyakeni baninzi abantu abangamaxhoba alomkhuba. Le ofisi iGauteng Rental Housing Tribunal ithi nje kweziveki ezimbini ivulile baninzi abantu abasebefake izikhalazo.
We find people returning from holidays, might not have paid rental or services and utilities, so would come to a place that might have been locked.
uMcLaren uthi ukuvalela ngaphandle ukucinywa kombane namanzi kunye nokuba semva kwerente zizona zikhalazo ezixhaphakileyo. Esinye sazo sesikaJanet Woodbridge noqeshisa ngezindlu kubantu abaswele indawo. uJanet uthi uzokhalazela umuntu osemva ngerente nonesimo sokuhlala ngexesha athanda ngalo. Uthi ile meko yamtyhalele kubeni ukuba amkhuphe ngetshovo endlini khona ukuze afake omnye umuntu.
I shouldn't have done it, but I didn't have a choice. He wasn't here. He hadn't I made many efforts to contact him. I have 3 phones. I phoned him from every one of them. I sent him SMSs. So I was left in a situation where basically he'd absconded.
Uphantse ugaxeleka ingxakini ngokwenza oko. Ngethamsanqa umba wakhe uyaqwalaselwa ile ofisi. Kwesinye isiganeko esifanayo esenzeke eGauteng eSprings, umninimzi zange abe nalo nyweba. Wathi evutha umsindo wakhupha impahla yomnxusi ngetshova wazibetha ngaphakathi kunye nempahla yakhe yena. Kwathi kanti uzibhudile kuba umnxusi wasuka waya enkundleni yamatyala apho wafumana khona umyalelo othi umnini indlu lowo makaphume aphele kungene umnxusi endaweni yakhe. uMcLaren uthi nokuba umnxusi usemva ngerente umzekelo oko akuniki bani igunya lokuba enze ukuthanda kwakhe ngaphandle kokulandela umthetho.
The legislation is very clear, is that no tenant can be evicted without a court order. Cut-off of services, such as including a lockout, cut-off of services without a court order can be can be seen as a criminal offence in terms of the legislation.
Kuyinyani ukuba umnini wendawo ngoyena unamandla kokugqitha umnxusi. Londo athi ufuna yenzeke iyenzeka nokuba umnxusi uyathanda okanye akathandi. uDipo Mahanyele ubenelisho lokufakwa ezincwadini zabantu abangahlawuliyo amatyala i-Credit Bureau ngolwasemzini ngelithi usemva ngerente. Uthi akho mnyani kwezo zityholo.
They are not even communicating nama tenants wabo. If you send an email or complainer, no one will respond to your email. If you call, they will ask you if you are calling because of a deposit or what. So it seems as if nje babuke imali nje indaba yokuthi bathola imali. They don't care ukuthi ama tenants bahlala kanjani, i-condition yakhona injani.
Ngoku ubeke ithemba lakhe lokugcinywa kwegama lakhe kule ofisi. I-Rental Housing Tribunal ijonga imiba enzima mihla le. Kodwa umyalezo wayo nolula uthi xa kukho iyanhlokwano makusinyiswe amajelo afana nala. Iofisi zokulambula impixwano phakathi komnxusi nomnini indawo zikho kumaphondo onke. Akukho nhlawulo ifunwayo. Kuvuyisile Mdoda, Yilungelo Lakho, eGauteng.
Well, masibulele ke ngelunqa kwesilenzelwe yi-producer yethu Vuyisile Mdoda. Now to take our discussion further on the issue of rights and responsibilities of tenants in a landlord-tenant relationship. Let's quickly welcome Michelle Dickens from the Tenant Profile Network. And just next to her is Mamudubi Mohlala Mulaudzi, yena uphuma phaa kwi-Gauteng Rental Tribunal. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And Happy New Year, by the way.
Compliments to you too.
All right. Now, I mean, we're looking at an issue. We know that around about this time, people are all over the place. There's migration, and people who have been urban dwellers are also looking for better property. We now see that you can actually approach the tribunal for your rental issues. But I think first things first, let's just talk about the establishment of the Rental Housing Tribunal and why was there a need to establish one?
Okay. Thank you very much. The Rental Housing Tribunal is an entity that's set up to resolve disputes between landlord and tenant emanating from a lease agreement. And one must understand a lease agreement doesn't have to be in writing. It can be a verbal or a written lease. Now, the specific legislation that applies to the Rental Housing Tribunal is the Rental Housing Act. And tribunals are established in each and every province. We are appointed by the MEC for human settlements within a particular province. We are constituted as 5 permanent members and 2 alternate members. But for a quorum of a hearing of the tribunal, you have to have 3 members. The tribunal resolves disputes through 2 procedures. Firstly, when you refer a dispute to the tribunal, we try and mediate a resolution. If we cannot mediate a resolution, then it's taken to arbitration, which is a full hearing. Mediation is a voluntary process. Arbitration is a court hearing. We have the same powers as a magistrate's court, meaning that whatever finding or ruling we come up with has the same force and effect as a court order. All right. The types of disputes we get are varying, but the most common that you get...
What's the most common? Take us through the most common.
Okay, the most common types of disputes you get would be a deposit refund. You also get situations where people... Yes, deposit refunds are always a big problem. But you also find tenants who will come through and argue that their rental amounts are too high. You'll find that they argue about the terms and conditions of their lease agreements. Some will also argue about the costs or the amounts that they're being levied in relation to services, which is your water and your electricity charges. So you get those kinds of complaints. Those are really the types of complaints you get from tenants. From landlords, we also get complaints from landlords. The majority of complaints that we get from landlords is where a tenant is not paying rent, so there's area rental issues, or there's an issue around payment of services. So those are in the large majority, those are the types of complaints we deal with on an ongoing basis.
Now, let's talk about the Act itself. Why kwaba khona isidingo sokuthi kube ne-Rental Housing Act?
Kwaba nesidingo because kwabona ukuthi kune problem because uthola ukuthi bargaining power between i-tenant ne-landlord ayifani. Landlord has got a higher bargaining power than i-tenant. And uthola ukuthi ama-tenants ayavictor all the time, or uthola ukuthi ama-terms and conditions at least are unfair to i-tenant. So uhulumende wabona ukuthi it's important ukuthi we must put, especially with the democratic dispensation, they then promulgated a Rental Housing Act, which was a piece of legislation that was supposed to even the playing field between landlord and tenant and protect the interests of all the parties. But what is also important, it must be understood, the Rental Housing Act is also there to make sure that investment in rental housing continues, so that there's clear rules of engagement, so that when a person invests in rental housing space, they know exactly what return they're going to get. Okay,
I think siphinde sibuye sixoxa eviction and what the procedure one must go through before they're evicting the tenant. Let's come to you, Michelle. The Tenant Profile Network. What is it exactly that you focus on when you're looking at the relationship between the landlord and the tenant?
So TPN is a credit bureau, and our responsibility is to collect information on tenant behaviour. And we collect it right throughout the country, nationally, from tenants who are renting from 500 Rand per month right up to 110,000 Rand per month. And from a credit bureau perspective, we look at positive information just as much as we look at negative information. So we're trying to understand for how long a tenant is in a property and how they pay their rent every single month to create some sort of environment that when a landlord comes and places the tenant, they know that the tenant that they're placing is going to be adequate and has the affordability assessment done on the property, on the tenant up front.
All right. Now, we're looking at the issue of eviction. We know that around this time, a lot of people will default in terms of payment. Some are moving out, and then when it comes to them being reimbursed in their deposits, it's also a long story, a lengthy story. The landlords and the agents will refuse to then reimburse the tenant. What role do you play in then making sure that what's due to the tenant is then refunded to them?
So our role in terms of analytics and research shows that January is a difficult time for tenants, but it's not difficult insofar as defaulting and not paying rent in its entirety. It simply delays when that payment date is made. So it's had an effect of pushing out, instead of being paid on time on the first tenant, most tenants are only paying their rent 3 or 4 or 5 days later. So the effect of January is late payment rather than pure delinquency. In terms of our processes, we are very transparent. So when we collect information from our landlords or our estate agents to say this is when the tenant has paid their rent, we're updating the tenant via SMS to say your payment profile on the credit bureau has been updated to display your partial payment, non-payment, in an effort to get tenants to pay earlier and more timeously with their rent. And I must point out that 85% of tenants are in good standing. So we do have an environment where tenants are performing well.
And how important would you say it is to have some sort of a documentation, an agreement between the tenant and the landlord before you even occupy the property?
I think Mama Dupi and I would agree on this full-heartedly. Documentation is critical. A lease agreement can be a verbal agreement, but it is very difficult to enforce a verbal lease agreement. So the better documentation you use and the more comprehensive it is that speaks to the terms of the lease agreement, the better. When it comes to dispute, whether it's brought before the Rental Housing Tribunal or brought before the Credit Bureau in terms of a tenant says my information is inaccurate on the Credit Bureau, the Credit Bureau must investigate that information, and within 20 business days we must make a finding on the accuracy of the information. Documentation is therefore very important.
And in cases, Mam Dupi, where you find, especially Malukshin, I mean, people don't really have some kind of formal document. It's a verbal agreement to Madlamini has got my flats at the end of the back of her house, and then she takes in tenants, and then within 3 months, she decides to change the terms of the verbal agreement, which they initially had. What role then do you play as the tribunal?
Okay, yes, no, we do get a lot of complaints from backroom dwellers as well, but obviously we think we should be receiving a lot more, because a lot of our complaints come from the inner city. But specifically in relation to what you're speaking to, yes, you do have cases where landlords want to unilaterally change the terms and conditions of a lease agreement. In that particular case, that particular tenant must approach us, and we will intervene to make sure that not only are the terms and conditions fair, but that there is no unilateral changes without there being proper consultation. Because in the middle of a lease, if a landlord wants to change any terms and conditions of the lease, they must consult with the tenant adequately. And if they cannot reach an agreement, then only then can the matter be referred to the tribunal for some intervention.
In terms of documentation, now that we're talking about documentation, there was never a lease when I occupy the property, and when I'm inside, is it important for me to keep the deposit slips just to ensure that I keep a record of my payments and to submit to you at the tribunal? Should there be a case or a need for me to approach you?
I couldn't agree more. It's very, very important that you keep records, because a lot of the time you'll find actually a dispute whereby the landlord says I never received the money and the tenant says I paid, and then how do you then prove that actually you paid? So it's quite important that tenants actually know that they should keep all documents. But even over and above that, it's also important that if it's possible to draft a lease agreement, it must be done. According to the law, a landlord has an obligation to conclude a lease if the tenant demands that. And there's simple leases from the CNA that a landlord can actually conclude with the tenant. So it's quite important that tenants learn to demand that they have a lease agreement in place.
All right. Well, Michelle, when coming back from the break, you'll take us through this eviction, or rather a court order, where a tenant was given rights to evict the landlord. I think that's quite interesting. Everybody would like to know about that. Well, if you want to find out more, please make sure that you join us after the break. So remember that you can also call us. The number is 011 7146918. and 6919. You're still watching Yilungelo Lakho right here on SABC1. I'm Zanzi for sure. We're coming back shortly. Stay with Well, welcome back. You're still watching Yilungelo Lakho right here on SABC1 Zanzi for sure. Kumble gemta kwethu kubanthe nawe ungayinxalenye yethu apha studio by calling us now on studio line. That is 011-714-6918 and 6919. Perhaps you've got issues or perhaps a dispute that you would like to forward to the tribunal or the ombudsman or you know, all sorts of legal institutes that come and play a role when it comes to the tenant and the landlord relationship. Please make sure that you call us right here in the studio, and please make sure that you also go and check out our Facebook page. Our Facebook page is at Yilungelo Lakho. Go and check out our status that we've uploaded today and then drop your comments. Now, before the break, I brought into your attention the issue of the eviction order that's coming from the court. Now, in this particular case, it's not the landlord evicting the tenant, which is per usual. It is the tenant that is evicting the landlord. Let's start with you, Michelle. How did this come about?
So this is an interesting case, although not completely unusual. What happens when a landlord gets frustrated with the court process? Sometimes they feel that the tenant's not paying, the court process for eviction is too long, so they feel they're going to take the matters into their own hands. And there's a number of different ways that they might choose to do that. They might choose to switch the electricity off. They might choose to lock the tenant out of the property. They might choose to move into the property themselves as the landlord, cohabitating with the tenant, or moving the tenant's furniture into the garage, which is what happened in this case. The landlord and her daughter moved into the property, moved the tenant's furniture out of the property. The tenant came home and said, that's an illegal act, and went straight to court and managed to obtain a spoliation order against the landlord, ultimately evicting the landlord out of her own property. Because due process wasn't followed. The landlord had the right to evict the tenant and had to go through due process to do that.
I would never imagine as a tenant I can actually move or evict my landlord. Possible kangakanani, especially masihlala emzini owodwa. I mean, can I move somebody who's staying in the same property as me? I mean, in this case, they moved in because maybe the tenant ubengabonakali la ikhona. What can I do in such a case?
I think the important lesson to learn from this experience is that as a landlord, you must never try to take the law into your own hands. Umthetho uyakhuluma ukuthi mawufuna ukuevict umuntu, if umuntu akabhadala rent, akabhadala electricity, umthetho uthi kune procedure ukufuna ukuyifollow isho ukuthi umevict. If uzawuzama ukuthola ama shortcut, uzama ukuthi uzawumove in because kule case le into yenzekile ukuthi landlord ibone ukuthi le tenant le yamhlupha ifuna ukuhamba, wathi uzawungena endlini. Acabanga ukuthi mangena endlini izawuhamba i-tenant, kanti i-tenant yahlala yathi mina nginephepha elingivumela ukuthi ngihlale la ndlini, lease agreement. So i-court futhi ngizohlala, and i-court yathi ke wena owner kufuneka uye court uqala i-process phansi ungacangi ukuthi uzawuthola ama-shortcut. And I think one thing ekufuneka people must understand, which is very important, ngama evictions. Kuna two types of evictions. Kune illegal eviction, kune legal eviction. Illegal eviction ilapho umuntu afike nje alahlela izinto zakho ngaphandle ngana court order. Umthetho is very clear, before unga-evict umuntu kufuneka uye court uthole court order. I know about it can take up 6 to 8 months, but you need to do that. And if umuntu is ever thrown out in that way, they don't even have to go to a court. If eviction is illegal, there's a tribunal. We then make an order on the very same day. By 4 o'clock, funagi landlord ibisembiselendli.
Wow.
A legal eviction is the one lapha landlord iye high court, itoli court order, then evict umuntu. And utoli sheriff izokuncedisa la.
So kumele ube nayo court order before you ukhipha umuntu orenta kwakho.
Correct. And i-sheriff iyeza izoyi-enforce, ikuncedisa ukuyi-enforce. Ngoba i-sheriff mayibonisa i-court order iyakuncedisa.
All right, well, let's go and hear what Colin has to say in Pretoria. Colin, welcome to Yilungelo Lakho. Colin?
Hello?
Yebo.
How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you.
I'm fine, thanks.
Yes,
I just want to ask.
Yes.
I just want to ask 1 or 2 questions here. Can the landlord increase the rent with 20% or more?
Okay. Within when you're renewing the lease or during your lease?
During the lease.
All right. Do you want to take that on the,
Okay.
perhaps Mam Tubi?
Yes, no, we deal with issues around rental and rental.
Colin is still on the line, so you can just talk to him.
Yes, we deal with issues of rental increases on an ongoing basis. Generally, what the law says, there's no longer rent control in South Africa, which means so long as a landlord undertakes a reasonable rental increase, and generally what is accepted is about 10%.
Okay.
But if it's something in excess of 10%, they can refer the matter to the tribunal. But what is critical to note, and this is what a lot of landlords don't do, you need to give the tenant 2 months written notice. 2 full calendar months written notice before you increase the rental. And if the tenant is not happy about the proposed increase, they need to, within that 2 months, approach the tribunal so that we can make a determination on whether the rental increase is reasonable. And the way in which we make a determination on whether the rental increase is reasonable is we do what is called a comparable rental. Into a comparable rental, building or in the same neighborhood, check rent, size, yes, the maintenance. So check if we increase maybe from 5 to 6,000, if next door rental 5,000 I increase, then we use that comparison. We compare is in the same area to make a determination what is it reasonable or not.
Okay. Is Colin still on the line? Yes, Colin, what's your next question?
The next question is about unilateral decision where the landlord decide to add something on something which was not on the rental agreement.
Okay, so they amend the agreement.
Yes, without my consent.
What can
Similarly, Colin, even in that particular case, the landlord needs to give you 2 months written notice, and they can't unilaterally impose it. If you are not comfortable with the proposed increase, then you can approach the tribunal, but you must have a discussion with your landlord. They need to speak to you. They need to explain why it is they want to increase, and they must give you 2 months notice. And if you're not happy in that with regard to the proposal, within the 2 months, you can approach the tribunal for resolution.
So I can dispute the amendments for as long as they're within the term that I've rented out or list out?
Correct.
Okay. Yes?
No, I just also want to emphasize, it doesn't have to be a written lease. And if you reach the end of the term of the lease, you go on to a month-to-month lease, which means you still have a legal tenancy, not unless the landlord gives you a notice of intention to terminate. Then you need to get legal intervention to determine your rights. All
right, let's jump and go and hear what Julie in Bedford View has to say. Julie, welcome to Yilungelo Lakho.
Hi, thank you. Can you please tell me one thing? I'm currently renting, but what I'd like to know is that I'm paying my rent, but I've heard that some of the other tenants are not paying their rent. And the landlord is telling me that the maintenance of the building is going down. And I don't think it's fair when I pay and the other tenants don't pay. How does the landlord support the building, pay rental, lights, water, electricity, sewer? You know, they've also got costs to cover.
Okay, Julie, just make me understand. Are you saying that you are paying your rent? But
yes, and there's other tenants in the building that are not paying exactly their rent, or they're paying a certain amount and they're paying less than me, and the building's maintenance is going down.
Are you renting under the same agency, or rather landlord?
No, I'm renting to a landlord.
And they are renting?
I would like to know is how does that landlord expected to pay his lights, water, electricity, etc., whatever other expenses he's got, when people do not pay in their rent?
Okay, Michelle would like to take on this one.
So I think it's very important...
She's still on the line.
Julie, I think it's very important that we determine whether it's the same landlord that all the tenants are renting from, or if it's sectional title and there are different landlords within, or maybe property owners living in the complex as well. As far as maintenance is concerned, it's the landlord's responsibility to maintain the structure of the unit, of the property, and the better maintained the property is, the better quality the tenant that they're going to maintain and they're going to keep. If you've got an environment, though, where you've got a sectional title complex and you've got multiple owners...
It's not sectional title.
It's the same landlord. Yeah, then it's absolutely the landlord's responsibility to maintain the property.
I know.
What can Julie do, though?
It's how can the landlord pay and maintain the property when people are not paying their renting?
Okay, what can she do? Julie, what do you want to do? Do you want to take this up legally?
No, I'm just saying, how does the landlord maintain the property when people are not paying in their rent?
Okay, would you suggest that perhaps she comes and she sends this to
So, Julie, I think you're asking a question from the landlord's perspective, and I like that, because what does a landlord do when he's got non-paying tenants and he needs to maintain the property?
Correct.
Ultimately, he needs to get his non-paying tenants out of the property, put in tenants that are paying so that he can
Through an
continue
eviction
through a
order.
legal eviction order so that he can continue to maintain his property. So that's the bigger picture.
All
Can I
right.
please just add?
Just quickly before we go for an ad break.
Just quick. A landlord also has the right to bring a claim for area rental at the tribunal. If a tenant is not paying, the landlord has the right to come and say to us, the tenant is not paying, and we make an order to compel those tenants to pay. So I'd like to encourage you to get your landlord to come to the tribunal, and we'll help resolve the matter.
All right. Well, I'm sure Julie got all the information that she needed. But furthermore, she can also go to the tribunal. And remember that you can also call us right here in the studio. The number is 011-714-6918 and 6919. After the break, I'll be checking out some of the Facebook messages you've sent me and some of the tweet messages you've sent me, whatever you'd like to call it. Please make sure that you hashtag Yilungelo Lakho and the issue that we're looking at today, and then we'll be able to catch your tweet in that way. But for now, let's quickly go and check the markets and see what's happening that side. We'll be coming back shortly. Boom. All right, welcome back. You're still watching Yilungelo Lakho right here on SABC 1 in Mzansi for sure. We're coming to you live. It's our very first show this year. Remember that I said you can call us right here in the show. The number is 011-714-6918 and 6919. Now, I said you can send me your Facebook messages. I've got a Facebook message that's coming from Temba Machaya. He basically says that he paid his rent on the 18th of December, 4 December last year. On the 31st, the landlord comes and he's demanding another payment. He then reminds the landlord that he had already paid for the month, which is December. The landlord says if he doesn't pay within a certain time or a few dates, then he'll have to be evicted. On the 1st of January, he comes back this month. He then demands that payment. Failure to do so, he then evicts, he threatens or intimidates the tenant. The tenant, with fear of being victimized, then moves out of their property. What then can he do? Can he still take that up because he left the premises or the property? Can he take that up and come to the tribunal just to get his refund?
Yes, definitely. We deal with a lot of cases like that whereby you find that tenants pay rent, there's a dispute with the landlord evicts them or asks them to leave. We actually will order that the rent be refunded if we're convinced that the rent was paid. Now the question...
But the case here is that he doesn't have any proof. He doesn't have a receipt. I'm sure it's one of those verbal arguments. He just paid and gave it to him.
Right.
Can you still defend
Yes,
such
no,
a case?
no. We look at the circumstances. We look at circumstantial evidence. For instance, if the tenant can come and show us that on that day he withdrew a lump sum equivalent to the rent from his bank account, it then becomes circumstantial evidence. If there's a witness that was there that can confirm that he saw the tenant paying the rent, that is also acceptable. But what we're now encouraging tenants to do is that everybody has got a camera on their cell phone. That if you're paying,
snap a selfie when...
Yes.
Okay.
So that you
snap
have
a selfie
record
when you're paying that
when
rent.
you're actually giving that. And it's actually worked quite successfully because now they're able to keep some record. Even if they don't get a receipt, you can see that he's handing over money to
All right. Michelle,
the
do you
landlord.
perhaps come across such cases on a day-to-day basis?
So from our perspective, we
As the Bureau?
absolutely need documentation as proof. And in terms of the Rental Housing Act, it's a requirement in law that our landlords and estate agents provide a receipt for proof of payment. If our tenant comes and says, I made this payment, but cannot substantiate the payment, it's very difficult then because we're going back to a he said, she said, we're looking at a statement of accounts. The majority of our agents are using statement of accounts though, as opposed to simple cash deposits.
But Ma'am Dupi, I mean, as the tribunal, you definitely look at issues that affect every landlord. I mean, there's always a need to have a third party who will actually come at your defense as a tenant when you're dealing with a landlord. How can I then access your office if I'm somebody in the Eastern Cape or I'm in Venda or Polokwane or somewhere deep rural in the KZN? Do you have national offices?
No, we don't, unfortunately. We only have provincial offices. Okay. But what happens is that every province is expected to have a rental housing tribunal. Okay. I do know that in some provinces, for instance, like the Free State and the Northwest, they're still in the process of establishing the housing tribunals.
Can I then refer my case into another province?
No, you cannot, unfortunately, because there's a jurisdictional issue. The property must be located in the province where the dispute has emanated. So we cannot deal with a complaint in Cape Town or in KZN. The housing tribunal in those areas have to deal with it. But the law says the MEC for Human Settlements in that province has an obligation to set up a housing tribunal.
Do you have one in KZN?
Yes, there is one in KZN.
All right, let's go and hear what Tembisa, whether Tembisa has referred a case to the tribunal in KZN. Tembisa, welcome to Yilungelo Lakho. Thank you so much for calling us. Tembisa?
Hello, how are you, sir?
Hello, Tembisa.
Yes, how are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, this is Nkosi Ngobese.
Can you please switch off your
From
TV?
Baba.
Please, can you kindly switch off your TV or your radio?
Okay. Okay, I'm going far from it.
It's fine. You will hear yourself on TV, on the phone.
Yes, can you hear
All right.
me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. What's
okay,
up?
just want to check, is there any rules whereby the landlord may be followed? You see, there's a landlord which is increasing the rent maybe each and every after 5 months it increases the rent. When you complain, she say you take and you go out of her property now. And now we are worried. Ngifuna ukuchecka la mhlawumbe uma ngabe ikhona indlela yokuthi singamreporta kanjani.
Okay. Umamdupu uzokutshela kahle ukuthi kumele. Okay. Yes, that's your first question. As Umamdupu uzokutshela kahle ukuthi kumele ukuthi wenzeni. Mamdupu, what can Tembisa do? Angenzani?
Okay. Yebo Tembinkosi.
Yes,
ngomthetho akufunekanga ukuthi umuntu increase rent phambi kwe 12 months iphela. Funeka increase every 12 months. If we increase before 12 months, funeka uye housing tribunal ukuthi bakhulume. And then bancedise ukuthi resolve the problem. But njengoba bengishilo ekuqaleni, funeka akuphi notice ye 2 months. Before umuntu ngeke avuke nje umuntu athi kusasa double rent. Kufuneke akufone, akuphi 2 months notice. Akutshele ukuthi izo increase ngelanga eliso. And if awujabule ngaleyo 2 months asakuphi notice, approach a tribunal ubatshele ukuthi nginenkinga and angijabule ngoba kwenzeka so.
All right. Temkos, all right. I think we just lost Temkosi.
Okay.
So this is the cases, the kind of cases that we deal with on a day-to-day basis,
Correct.
Especially those who are tenants. I'm sure many would know that when it comes to issues of payment, there is always a need to have a third party, especially uma kungekho umuntu wesithathu to prove ukuthi ngikhokhile deposit mangena manje sengiyaphuma ngifuna deposit, and ama landlord are saying, oh, we need to do inspection, oh, by the way, there's a broken handle, oh, there's a window, there's this, and then at the end ayitholakali i-land deposit. Angenza kanjani umuntu njalo?
Look, as I said, when it comes to izinto ezinjalo, if akunama documents, we need to look at our circumstances. Maybe if une witness or una something engafakaza ukuthi why keep leyo deposit ngaleso sikhathi.
All right.
But in most cases, uthola ukuthi ama landlords vele ayavuma.
Okay.
It's only 1 or 2 that are unscrupulous abazawuthi hayi akangiphangi deposit.
Yeah.
And if unama deposit slip, because akuphumi noma ngakuphangi receipt, when I make sure ukuthi ufaka imali ebank, ukuthi uzoba ne deposit slip. Noma uyifake ku ATM yaskiphi slip ukuthi uyifakile. So if ungasibonisa ama deposit slip akho, siya accept ukuthi uye wayikhipha leyo deposit, and make sure ukuthi uyayikhipha lawo ma receipt until ngalelo langa uzahamba as proof ukuthi ufakile.
So can I then charge the landlord for a delay of reimbursing me of e-land or e-deposit?
No, what really happens ukuthi landlord might hold deposit, and I think you're making a very important point. Might hold deposit ayidli leyo mali. Funeka ngomthetho funeka ithatha ifake ku trust account and interest bearing account, so that ngalelo langa mawuphuma khona ayikhipha if funeka refund. But into ayithola ko interest.
All right.
We are totally interest yakho lapho. So the longer they delay, the more interest you get.
Okay.
So you get your interest plus deposit refunded. And abantu abaningi abayazi leyo nto uthola ukuthi bathatha nje deposit, but kufuneka bakuphi interest, and the interest is anything between 2 to 4% yaleyo mali per annum.
Okay, before I get to you, Michelle, let's quickly go to Anonymous, who's calling us from Gauteng. Anonymous, welcome to Yilungelo Lakho. Anonymous? All right, it seems like we've lost Anonymous. But for now, let's just look at the do's and don'ts of eviction. The magistrates' court, firstly, I'm sure we're going to have a slide right there on the screen. The eviction without a court order. A magistrate or high court can order, apparently. But how do I access? Especially in the case where in my province, there is no tribunal. I'm also looking at an issue of legal costs. Costs, it's going to be too much. I'll probably pay more than what I'm claiming. What can I do without, really paying too much, but still make sure that
Unfortunately, if I go to tribunal is the only statutory body where our services are completely free. We don't charge, you don't even need a lawyer. If you come, if the other side in a lawyer, we're not a lawyer, we are lawyers, the people who preside, so we're there to bridge the gap. But if I go to tribunal in your province, unfortunately, you have to go to a lawyer.
You have to go to a lawyer. Well, did you go to a lawyer?
Or legal aid.
Although
You can go to legal aid as well.
to legal aid,
Yes.
but it's still going to be a lengthy process.
Correct.
All right. Well, if perhaps you have got an issue that you'd like to share with us right here on the show, please make sure that you call us. We'll be taking calls still after the break. 011-714-6918 and 6919. I'm checking your Facebook messages. I can see it's quite a lot, a bit overwhelming, but I'll go through them each one. And if we don't read your message, please make sure that you don't dismay. After the break, we'll continue with our discussion. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. You're still watching Yilungelo Lakho right here on SABC 1. We're coming to you live. So I said you must send me your messages. Now, I'm going to check some of those messages you've sent me on Facebook. Now, ladies, let's have a look at Abraham Hassani Mashimbi, who says, how long should a notice be, or rather, how long must be served with before eviction? I think he's trying to find out how long should the notice be.
Well, really, it's a court process. It's about them issuing summons against you and starting the process against you. And it takes between 6 to 8 months.
Okay. Soweto Twayimbu rather, he says, I just want to know if it's legal to ask for interest generated by a deposit during your stay or lease. Michelle?
Yes, absolutely. If your landlord's holding your deposit, you're going to get your deposit back with interest. If your estate agent's holding your deposit, that's regulated by the Estate Agency Affairs Act, in which case the estate agent and the board will hold your interest. So it's very important that you understand who is ultimately holding your deposit.
All right. I think the third one, Oscar Specialist Kupuna, is trying to emphasize the need to have a deposit slip when you've paid the rent. Golani Ongo says, I'm renting and there's no agreement on paper between me and the landlord. If he decides to evict me, does he have to evict to give me an eviction notice?
Okay, let me just explain. Even if you have a verbal lease, the Act stipulates what are the generally accepted terms and conditions of the contract of lease. So even if it's not written, the guideline will be the Act. It will talk to issues like if they want to increase your rental, they must give you 2 months notice. If they want to terminate the lease, they must give you at least 30 days notice. But in the case of an eviction notice, that has to go through a court process.
All right. Well, let's go and hear what Isaiah has to say in Bulugwane. Isaiah, must come get in there.
Hello, Daddy. Yebo. Alright, yebo nathi. Ngifuna ukuyazi ukuthi na njengoba mhlambe ndinema-bedroom manje abantu barenda kumzini wami. I-tax ngifanele ngibhatale i-tax ngoba umthetho uthi every business must pay a tax. Yebo, ngifuna ukuyazi laa.
You're saying you want to ufuna ukwazi baba ukuthi kumele ukhokhe i-tax yini?
Yeah, ngifuna ukuyazi ukuthi ingaba kunemthetho.
Okay,
ingaba kunemthetho uthini uba warentisa abantu babhatale irent kuwe, ingaba kunemthetho uthi wena ubhatale tax ngoba une-business.
All right, Moptitu, do you want to take on that?
Yes, no, into enzeka kubaba ukuthi if uyarentisa and uyi-VAT vendor, registered for i-VAT, ungayi-charge i-VAT kuleyo rent, and then at the relevant time then uyibhatale ku-receiver of revenue ku-SARS.
Usekhona baba?
Ngisekhona baba.
So umzwile mabdupu ukuthi uthini?
Ngiyeva ukuthi
Uyi-charge ku-tenant, ma-charge ku-rent. Yes, ma-ubhatala isi-rent, then wena ubhatale ku-receiver of revenue, like any other business.
All right. Thank you so much. Now, let's quickly, ladies, go through the do's and don'ts, especially the self-help eviction. Now, before that, let's get into commercial rentals. Michelle, do you deal with that?
Yes, we do. So we collect information on how a tenant pays their commercial, their office, their retail, their industrial rent. And if a tenant's been loaded on the credit bureau, they still have the right to come and dispute the accuracy of the information. And we follow the same process of 20 business days to investigate the accuracy of the information. And whilst that process is underway, we will mask it. So we will not, as a bureau, we're not going to show information on a person's credit profile that is being challenged.
Ma'am Tupi, you said you don't deal with commercial
No,
issues.
we only deal with residential leases because we are there really to protect an individual's right to shelter. So basically, our mandate comes from the Constitution and the legislation, which talks about the right to access shelter, which would then mean we only deal with residential leases because commercial leases are considered to be a luxury.
Is there an organization perhaps that you refer them to in cases?
No, really. If you are not happy, you can go to the National Consumer Commission. You can go, if it's a Johannesburg lease, you can go to the Ombudsman in Johannesburg.
Okay, you probably assume that commercial is luxury.
Yes, it's not an essential.
All right.
Because it will be a person who's an entrepreneur, who's in business, or who's renting business
Can afford
purposes.
a lawyer.
Yes.
Well, quite an assumption.
And they,
All right,
they can
let's
afford to
quickly
go to
Parktown
court.
and take on our next caller. Welcome to the show, Selena.
Hi, Ntadelegay.
Sikhona mama kunjani?
Ngiyaphila baba. Igama lami nguSelina, and then ngifuna ukubuza. Ngibe ngine-flat, ngadeposita a-flat in Yilungelo. And so ngisebenza as a domestic worker. So ngikhala emsebenzini, mangikhala emsebenzini kwenzeka ukuthi i-flat nekade ngirenta kulo ngalikhipha deposit. Ngashiya abantu ukuthi bangibhekele lona. Esinasho ukuthi ngi-ofile ngiye kulala kulo kuyenzeka kanjalo. So kwenzeka ukuthi ngiba busy emsebenzini angikwazi ukuthi ngikhala kuleyo flat leyo. Ngithe time goes on mangithi ngivele flat ngingathola ukuthi bathathe iflat lelo bazinikeza abantu ngabakade ngikhala nabo laphana endlini. Mangithi ngicela imali yami ya deposit bangitshela izitori eziningi ngapenda bangigive up. Manje ngifuna ukwazi ukuthi ngenze njani ukuthi ngithole imali yami back ye-deposit ngoba agreement yethu bathi ma ungena ukhipha i-deposit masho ukuthi awusalifuna iflat bakunikeza imali yakho deposit.
All right, Ma'am Tupi, did you get what you're saying,
not
basically?
really.
I think it's an issue with the deposit. She paid a deposit when it's a payment issue. She paid a deposit. She was sharing the property with other people. I think there was a problem. She couldn't pay the rent, so she moved out. She came back. I assume that she had some belongings of hers within the property. Then the place was given to another tenant. Now she wants to know if she can access that deposit back.
Yes, no, she's entitled to get her deposit back if she can obviously show that.
Despite
yes.
her being in errors when it comes to arrears, when it comes to
well,
payment.
if she's in arrears and with rental, then it's a different story because the Act is very clear that the deposit can be withheld for damages to the property or for area rental or for areas and services. So if there are areas, they will deduct that portion of areas. If it consumes the entire deposit, then she will not get anything back. If it consumes a portion, then she'll get refund of that portion that has not been consumed by the debt.
All right. Well, let's quickly go for another commercial break. Usabukele thina apha kuyilungelo lakho siphethe imiba ephathelene nawe njengomrendi. So mastandi ke kuthi awuzukwazi ba uvele ukhuphe nje umuntu. There must be a proper procedure that you must follow. You must have an eviction order from the court, and when as the tenant you still have a responsibility. There are still issues that a procedure that you have to go through. Should you fail rent, you should make that known to the landlord. After the break, we're wrapping up our discussion. Please make sure that you stay with us. Okay, well, you're still welcome right here on Yilungelo Lakho. Now, we're going to give you the closing remarks. Just quickly, the do's and don'ts when you're renting out property, or rather when you're leasing out property as the tenant and the landlord. Let's quickly look at that slide we've got right there. It's do's and don'ts on eviction, self-help eviction, changing the locks on all the tenants' doors so they cannot enter their own home. Is that legal?
That's illegal. It's a lockout.
It's a lockout?
Yes, it's like
so
an eviction.
it's not allowed?
It's illegal.
All right. Removing all of the tenant's possessions from the property, Michelle, is that allowed?
Very dangerous. It's illegal as well, and you could be threatened with theft of the tenant's goods.
So what happens when the tenant disappears for 4 months?
You've got to go through the legal process. You've got to start your eviction order and you've got to go through due process. And if you obtain your eviction order, the sheriff will come and move the tenant out of the property, not you.
All right. Turning off tenants' utilities so they have no access to water and electricity.
That is very common because landlords think they can push you out. That in itself amounts to a constructive, what we call a constructive eviction, because a tenant is entitled to undisturbed occupation and the landlord has an obligation to give you access to services and utilities.
All right, now let's look at the responsibility of the tenant not giving proper notice and just moving out. Is that legal? What happens then?
No, the tenant would then be liable for the rent. The tenant is entitled to give early cancellation, 20 business days, and he's responsible for the rent during that early cancellation process.
All right, as the tribunal, what's your closing remarks? Just quickly, few seconds.
Please, people should refer matters to us. We are here to facilitate and assist, and our services are for free.
Okay. Michelle, closing remarks?
We're a credit bureau. We want you to see your free credit report. It's an annual report provided to you. Phone us, get in touch with it, and have a look at it and make sure it's accurate.
All right. Oh well, that was Yilungelo Lakho this week. That's it from me, Sipho Nzaumbi, and the rest of the team. Till next time, it's goodbye and God bless you. See you again next Friday. Catch our repeats every Monday at 12 p.m. right here on SABC 1 Sunset for sure. Tiko, I'm